All right, I guess we're ready to start. Hebrews chapter 12 is where we're going to be. Hebrews chapter 12. That's what we're going to look at. Yeah, he was, Chester Russell, he was here, but he's got a cane. He's moving slowly. And his problem is his blood pressure. And he's going to see a kidney doctor tomorrow. And he's hoping to find out from the kidney doctor, some solution. I don't know blood pressure numbers well, but he said last night he was at 240, and then today he was at 110. So that's his problem. It goes back and forth. So you got your systolic and diastolic and all that stuff I learned in school, but I'm not very good at identifying numbers. I think you're good on the top as long as it's not over 140. Is that right? And you're good on the bottom as long as it's not over 100? 80. Okay. You don't get too concerned at 90? They don't get too concerned at 90? Okay. I've always been at 120 over 60, and they've never had to talk to me, so I guess that's all right. They still take my blood at the blood bank thing. Oh, boogers. I always run into trouble with the blood bank. I have O negative, which is a bad type of blood if you go to a blood donation deal. When we lived in, when we first married and lived in Tupelo, I used to go get blood a lot. One of the reasons my father had such illness was he had a blood transfusion, and the blood was tainted. He got hepatitis from it. So I'd always, kind of in honor of him, give blood every time I had opportunity. And I had O-negative blood, and I had low cholesterol, high iron, all that stuff. And so they would always want my blood because they said they'd give it to babies. And they gave me a T-shirt one day, and the T-shirt said, "I'm a baby donor." And I loved that shirt, and I would wear it, and it would embarrass Kala like crazy. And somehow that shirt disappeared one day. I still haven't figured out what happened to that shirt. But I just say something to Kyla and she smiles, so I don't know. Hey, Tom, you want a sheet?
Thank you, sir.
No problem. But I still haven't figured out what happened to my shirt, but it's around somewhere. Now, we've run through the book of Hebrews. We're here at the end of chapter 11. You'll notice, do you notice how we ran quick through the first couple of chapters and we spent 2 weeks on chapter 10 and 3 weeks in chapter 11? I didn't mean to slow down that way, but we just kind of did. And we've run through, of course, remember, as you work through Hebrews, chapter 10 is the meat. What you're doing is you open up, you're looking at Jesus is greater than Moses, Jesus is greater than the angels, Jesus is the great high priest, Jesus is the one who fulfills everything. You go through and you see all these quotations, especially out of the book of Psalms, going up to get us to chapter 10. You get to chapter 10, and we've joked about it so much, you probably remember now. It's the lettuce chapter, right? You got your 3 lettuces, okay? Lettuce in verse 22, lettuce in 24, and lettuce in 26 through 28, right? Come before him and be cleansed. Live a faithful life and exhort and help one another daily so much as you see the day approaching. That's the 3 roles of what Christians need to do. Hebrews is very basic because you're taking people who have moved out of their Christian life and they're having trouble staying where they need to. They're wanting to go back to the old ways, the old habits. It's a lot easier living over on that side. And the writer of Hebrews is saying, stay faithful. Now, to fortify chapter 10, he goes through chapter 11, and what do we know chapter 11 as? Yeah, it's a book of faith, the Faith Hall of Fame. And we go through, and we discussed last week, when we start, we hit those giants, right? You got Abel, you got Noah, you got Abraham, you got Isaac, these huge, who we look back at them, we think, man, that was just awesome. The things that Abraham did to leave his homeland to come here. Those are big deals, okay? Now, you get to the end of chapter 11, suddenly it gets a little more rocky, right? Because we start looking and we see fellas like Barak, and we see people like Samson, and we see people like Gideon. And we think to ourselves, wait a second. I studied these guys back in the book of Judges. I'm not sure about them being these huge giants of faith. Because looking at Barak, what did Barak do? You remember him? He was working with the judges, I guess you would say, Deborah. Was Barak willing to stand up? He was scared. He said, Deborah, I'll only go if you're willing to go with me. And I'm afraid of leadership. And so as we get, that's Judges 4, where we see Barak. When we get to chapter 5, that's what Deborah's song is about. A lot of times people, especially here lately, people who are arguing about role of women and such, they'll bring up Deborah was a judges. If they'd read chapter 5, they'd view things a little different. Chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, oh, if the leaders would lead in Israel, oh, God would be praised. Oh, if leaders would stand up. What she's doing, she's saying, hey, the reason I'm having to do this is because none of these men around here will do their job. None of them are willing to stand up and do what they need to do. And so you have Barak. But Barak, even though he was scared, he acted on his faith, went with that army, and he was victorious. Gideon, remember him threshing wheat in a wine press? Remember the fleece back and forth? We talked about that last week. He kept saying, oh, okay, I'll go if I have a huge army. And God says, no, you can only go with 300. Gideon was always nervous. But the writer of Hebrews says, look at him. He was a man of faith. Well, he faltered, but he still acted as God wanted him to act. And so things went well. Samson, Judges, that's Judges 13 through 16. You got Samson, who did everything wrong, right? God blessed him with a great gift. The Spirit of the Lord would be upon him. He could do great things. Killed 600 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. He tied up all those foxes, tied their tails, and sent them on fire out through he was a thorn in the side of the Philistines, as the prophecy said of him. But Samson's problem was he didn't trust God. He didn't have a relationship with God. The only time, we see Samson pray is at the end of his life. And the only time that he acts like he needs God is at the end of his life. But as he dies faithful in battle against the Philistines. Now, why about the Gideons and the Samsons and the Baraks? Give us hope. Because we look at ourselves, and a lot of times I don't see myself as an Abraham, and I'm not much of a Noah. I find myself sometimes as a Gideon. Like, God, are you really sure? I just need a little more sign. Or I see sometimes myself as a Barak. I'll go if somebody goes with me and helps me. Or sometimes I see myself as a Samson, who too often in life tries to, and I don't use God to the very end. And so the writer says, hey, look, these people are people. You need to be like these people that old way. And don't fall back into that old way of living. So that's what brings us to chapter 12. Now let's look at chapter 12 and let's look in verse 1. Okay? What you have on here, this is New King James, but any translation will do. Therefore, we also, since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. All right? Therefore, when you see therefore, what do you got to ask? What's it there for, right? Okay. You notice this is used over and over and over in the book of Hebrews. It's looking back. So you'll run across a lot of commentaries. You'll say, okay, this great cloud of witnesses, is it talking about the angels seeing us? Is it talking about Jesus seeing this? Who is it talking about? Well, if it says therefore, look at the chapter before. And the picture that the writer of Hebrews is trying to get across is that you're in a big amphitheater. Think Rupp Arena. Or even think about Marshall County over there at the basketball. Okay? Think about all these people in that gym cheering for you. Go, go. And they're excited about you. And that's what the writer is talking about. He says we're running the race, and all these people around are cheering for us. The Abrahams, the Noahs, the Isaacs, the Gideon and Jephthah, all these people see what you're going through, and they want you to do the best you can do, and they want things to go well for you. So here we are in this arena, and what's he say to do with all these weights? What are we to do with the weight and the sin? Lay it aside, okay? Now, we're going back a little bit to the Greek games, which were just hugely popular back at this time. We'd oftentimes have trouble in Jerusalem because in Jerusalem, about 30 BC, they put in one of those Colosseums, and it was near the temple, not exactly at the temple, but near the temple, and it got the Jews aggravated because people left the temple worship to go watch the games. You know, it was just like today, you know. If Kentucky's playing, if somebody else is playing, a lot of times church attendance will go down because we love watching competition. But the thing about these competitions back at this time is the Greeks who came up with these games took it serious. You see, if you won the big games in the Olympics back in the Greek days, if you won, you got the crown. Now, we talk about a crown and how that's pretty neat and cool. If you own the crown, guess what? You didn't pay taxes. Now, would that be something that would be an incentive? Oh, without a doubt. If somebody said, hey, you win this race, you don't have to pay taxes for the rest of your life, would you be running? That's right. You know, that's worth running. I think I would run for that one, you know. I would run for that one. And so there was a lot of incentive. So what the Greeks would do is they would say, I'm not going to let anything hinder me. Of course, robes, you can't run in robes. So what did they wear during these races? Nothing, all right? And so these people watching the race, sure they were there to watch them run. Sure they were, you know. You have all these people running naked, trying to finish the race as quick as they could. It was a place of a lot of immorality when you go back to those ancient Greek games. Now, okay? But today, there's a lot of emphasis. You get these runners. They're looking for shoes that weigh just 4 ounces or 3 ounces, getting as absolutely light as possible. You look at the jerseys that they're wearing when you see people running marathons. It's as little as you possibly can get away with because you don't want any weight that's there. You don't want any difficulty that's there. Now, we're in the auditorium adult class, so we're not going to do this. But when I'm teaching this in a teenage class, what I'll do a lot of times is I will find the most athletic guy. That's the reason I'm not going to do it in here is because we got so many athletes. But I'll find the most athletic guy, and then I'll find the nerdiest guy, the guy who looks like, you know, the only thing he runs to is his Nintendo to play, you know. And I'll say, okay, these two guys are going to run in a race. Who's going to win? Everybody's going to pick this guy, right? Well, then I'll say, wait a second. This guy has to hold this person and this person. And he'll have to put both of those people over his shoulder. Then I'll say, okay, who's going to win this race? Well, if you get enough weight on this guy is finally going to be able to beat him, right? I was playing with Skylar Smith the other day. You know, he's on his crutches. And I said, I think I can finally beat you in a race. Maybe. We never really did race because I think he still could beat me. But, you know, it's one of those things where if you have a lot of encumbrances, you're not going to win the race. And that's what the writer is bringing out here. He says, okay, you're running the Christian race, but your problem is you've got all these sins that make you stationary. And you can't do that Christian walk unless you lay those things down. And that's what happens to a lot of people in their Christian life. They say, yeah, I want to go to heaven as long as I can take this relationship, which is not a godly relationship. As long as I can take this, I'll go ahead and run that race. But they're not going to be able to finish. Other people say, yeah, I want to go to heaven. I'm willing to run the race as long as I can also have this worldly activity or that worldly activity or whatever else it might be. And so that's what the writer of Hebrews is saying is these people are cheering you on. And you've got to lay off these sins. You've got to set these things aside. And you've got to have the confidence that there is nothing that's going to catch you. Nothing that's going to keep you from being exactly where you need to be. That's how you win sports. is you absolutely have to be dedicated to your craft, to do exactly what it is that God wants you to do. I went to a community college when I was in high school. A guy there was named Larry Johnson, which he's retired. He played for the Knicks, and he played for, I think it was the Orlando team for a while when he was drafted. Now, he was a good guy. He left college, and he went over to play for UNLV, won the national championship and all that. What interested me about him was, first of all, he was in college and couldn't read. I thought that was interesting. But secondly, the guy was so big. But he practiced every day. 500 shots every morning, 200 shots every day at lunch, 500 shots every night. And his thing, as I was talking to him, he would find about 6 places on the floor that he could shoot from, and that's where he would shoot every one of his shots. And so when he was playing ball, he'd find those sets, and he would make it. And it was interesting, even watching him in the NBA, he would get to that section right off the key there, and every time it wouldn't even hit the rim. It would just go right in. And people would say, he's such a great shot. I'd always think they'd make a move over a foot. He'd never make it. But he knew his craft, and he would not allow anything to keep him from getting to the NBA. Even if it was a book, he would not allow it to stop him. We see that with runners. We see that with football players, baseball players. You have to lay everything aside. Now, as Christians, why do we have trouble not laying everything aside? Why is it so hard? Okay, motivation. Yeah, I want to go to heaven, but just not right now, right? I think that's a country song. If it's not, it should be. Should be one again. Want to go, just not right now. All right. Why else? Christianity would be easy if it was a sprint, right? If it was over in 3 days or even a week, it'd be easy. But when it's a marathon, it's the next 30 or 40 years of your life, it's a little harder to stay motivated. Okay, we learn to trust ourselves instead of God. That's a good point. We learn to trust ourselves instead of God. Okay, run with endurance has passive endurance and active persistence. You see those two there? There's the endurance and also persistence. Both of those are there. The runner has to strive. That means stretch as far as he can, like they lean forward to cross the ribbon when you're running, and especially a sprint. He has to have self-control, 1 Corinthians 9:25. And also, this is the bummer, you got to follow the rules and you got to finish. You remember several years ago, the Boston Marathon? This is like late 70s, early 80s. You remember that guy who won? Nobody ever heard of him. And he won by about 2 minutes, and everybody thought that was just crazy. And he actually was on the news and everything. People were just amazed. He'd set a record time. Then they got looking a little closer at him, and he wasn't even sweating. You remember what he had done? He had taken a cab. He stopped on the side and took a cab almost to the finish line, sat around and waited till about the time, and then he hopped out back on the road and ran the rest of the way. And won the race until they figured out what he had done. Okay? All right? Christian-wise, you see people that way? Sure. Man, they're here Sunday, they're singing those songs, and they're praying those prayers and reading that Bible. But as soon as they're out of the church building, what are they doing? Not exactly the same thing. They're cussing at work. They're watching things they don't need to be watched, doing things they don't need to be doing, smoking things they shouldn't be smoking. You know, you go on through all those things, and then here they are right back at church the next Sunday, as holy and religious as you can be. You see, they're breaking those rules. Now, that works as long as nobody catches you, right? As long as nobody catches you, that works great. What's the problem with that? Do you have to impress your preacher? No. Do you have to impress your elders? That's not who puts you in heaven or gets you out of hell. Who is it? God. Okay. And it's really, really hard to hide from God. Just ask Jonah. Just ask Adam and Eve. It doesn't work very well. It doesn't work at all. So what is our focus? Look to Jesus. He is the author and finisher of our faith, the beginning and the end of all things which are there. Okay? Very rich passage there, those first two verses. Okay? Now let's look at verse 3. For consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you also become weary and discouraged in your souls. You have not yet resisted the bloodshed, striving against sin, and you have forgotten the exhortation which speaks to you as sons. My son, do not despise the chastening, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens and scourges every son whom he receives. If you endure the chastening, God deals with you as sons. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten? But if you're without chastening, of which all have become partakers, then you're illegitimate and not sons. Furthermore, we have had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits, and live? For they indeed for a few days chastened us, as seemed best to them, but he for our profit, that we might be partakers of his holiness. Now no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but painful. Nevertheless, afterwards it yields peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Okay. Let's focus first of all on those first two verses, 3 and 4, beginning of 4. Okay? Okay? Considered him who endured from hostilities of sinners against himself, lest you also become weary and discouraged in your souls. Is it hard to be a Christian? Yeah, it's hard. If you do it right, it's hard. This idea of self-sacrifice, of not getting to do what everybody else gets to do. I remember being a teenager and being in the early parts of college at state schools and such. Everybody drinks except you. And is it hard if you're in the dorm room and everybody pulls out whiskey or pulls out vodka and starts passing it around and you say no? It's hard. But you do it. Why? Because you're a Christian. Is it hard not to cuss when everybody around you cusses? Yes. But when you think, man, that's sorry, especially as a young person and open to peer pressure and everything else, you think, man, that's sorry, and man, that's hard to do. What the writer of Hebrews is saying is, wait a second, if you think you have it hard, look at Jesus on the cross. When you start saying, man, I'm suffering, and man, it's too hard to be a Christian, and man, this is sorry, and see how your suffering compares to his. Now, in this first century, some people who are Christians were losing their jobs. Well, it's not good to lose your job. It's not good to try to find a new way to provide for your family. But compare it to what Jesus went through. Some people say, man, it's hard to live this way or that way or whatever else it may be. Compare yourself to Jesus and what it is that he's enduring. Okay? Now, he goes back and he quotes, talking about the chastening of the Lord. And I find this really interesting. According to the Bible, if you love your kids, you'll do what? You're going to discipline them. According to the Bible, if you do not love your children, you're going to let them act however they want to act. A lot of illustrations. The clearest one that comes through, especially in Judaic literature, is Eli and his sons. Remember Eli? That's the judge right before Samuel, in the opening chapters of 1 Samuel. Eli had his two sons. Let me remember, Hophni and Phinehas, right? Okay, had his two sons, and he loved his sons, theoretically. But Eli just never did anything. His sons would commit fornication with the women at the entrance of the tabernacle. I mean, how much worse could you be than that? His sons would take the sacrifices planned for God, and they would just take them and eat things which weren't theirs. They were very, very selfish. They were very, very bratty, and they were very, very immoral. And Eli would go up to them and say, my sons, you really shouldn't be doing this. You shouldn't be acting this way. And I'd really prefer you not do it. And then they would go on living the way that they lived. And according to Scripture, that meant Eli really didn't love his children and didn't really love the Lord. And I joke about this. You ever see a parent get in an argument with a 2-year-old? I really wish you wouldn't do it. An argument with a 2-year-old. You need to discipline them. Now, that doesn't mean to knock the snot out of them, right? And it doesn't mean to be abusive in any way, but parents who love their children will discipline. Now, you got to get that principle across to see what the writer of Hebrews is saying here. The writer of Hebrews is saying the reason you're going through this is because God loves you. Now, it doesn't feel like God loves you, does it? All right. God's saying the same thing. God is saying, I'm allowing you to go through these troubles in life, so that you can grow, so that you can be purified, and so that you can show your Christian faith. In the very next book, we see this in the very opening, right? James 1, beginning in the verse, let's begin in verse 2. Consider it pure joy, my brethren, whenever you face fears and trials of many kinds, because you know the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work, so that you can be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. If any of you lacks wisdom, let's just stop there in verse 4. You go through, what James is saying is, you be happy when you're enduring troubles, because this helps you to grow. This helps you to become stronger, to become greater. Now, do you feel that way when it's happening? No. Going back to the analogy of sports, okay? Is there anybody who likes practice that's normal? If you're practicing the right way, you're going through and you're suffering and you're hurting. 2-a-days for football in August when it's 100 degrees outside and everybody else is sitting in air conditioning and you're outside running up and down a hill, or you're lifting weights or doing whatever. Or if you're in cross country, you're running mile after mile after mile, or you're doing gassers if you play basketball, or running bleachers. Is there anybody who just says, man, that is awesome and I love it? No, but you practice, you endure those things. Why? So you can what? To win the crown. You do those things because in basketball, if you have gotten yourself in shape and run enough gassers, when you've only got a few minutes left in the game, you can run the court when nobody else can run the court. You do it so in football in the fourth quarter, when you are giving everything you've got, the other team runs out of gas and you still got enough to finish the game. You do those things because no matter how stressed you are, no matter how big the moment is, exactly what your swing is going to look like every time you do it, exactly what your throw is going to look like every time you throw it, because you've done it so much and so often. In the Christian life, we endure what we endure because it helps us to be closer to God. And it helps us to hold to Him in a better way, in a more complete and perfect way. And so that's what he's going through when he talks about this chastening. No chastening is joyful for the present, but we endure it because it makes us better. Now, you raise a kid in the church, all right? You raise a kid in the church and tell him that he never has to give up anything. Tell him that every friend he has is a Christian and you're never going to face peer pressure of an evil way of any sort, and make his life as easy as possible. When he moves out of the house, moves away, and he's around people who aren't Christians, what's going to happen to him? It's going to be harder if he hasn't learned about endurance. Now, do I believe in youth groups? Absolutely, I believe in youth groups. And I believe in making it as easy to be a Christian as possible. But I also recognize there are times where each of us needs to have to endure so that we're stronger, so that we're better, and so that we're closer to God. I think that's something really. Yeah. Right. The joy that was set before him, which was a cross. And you think, that's not fun at all, you know. But Jesus went through the cross seeing the finish line, seeing where he's going. Yeah, it's a good point to bring up. Real good point. All right, verse 12. I like this one. We got the hands, the knees, and the feet, okay? Therefore, strengthen the hands which hang down and the feeble knees, and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be dislocated, but rather healed. Pursue peace with all people and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. looking carefully lest anyone fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness spring up causing trouble. Or profane person like Esau, who for one morsel of food sold his birthright. For you know that afterward, when he wanted to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no place for repentance, though he sought it diligently with tears. All right, those hands, those knees, and those feet, okay? Think about somebody who has been running or somebody who has endured something great. Whether he's been working hard all day or whatever else. Think about some of these marathon runners after they have hit the 18-mile mark, after they have hit, the wall. They're just barely walking, right? And you can just imagine them as they fall down. What he's saying is brace yourself, put yourself back in the right posture, firm. Leave the path. Don't allow yourself to the troubles you're going through to knock you aside, but keep running and keep going with exactly what you need to do. Okay, 14 sort of starts a new section. We're going to look at some of these things here. 14, pursue peace with all men. You ever going to get to the point where everybody likes you? If everybody you know likes you, you don't know enough people. All right? But Romans 12:18 says, as far as it is among you, or as far as it is within you, you be at peace with all people. If someone hates you, don't let it be your fault that they hate you. That's something important for us to remember and something important for us to know, right? Pursue peace with all men. Pursue holiness. What is holiness? Being godlike, right? Being set apart for his purpose. Don't fall short of that grace which is there. Root of bitterness. I love that analogy, root of bitterness. It comes from the book of Deuteronomy, where it talks about how with intermarriage and with following some of these profane practices, a root of bitterness will come back in. Think, let's see, in a few months, we're going to all be doing our landscaping, getting ready for the spring, right? Okay. Think if you have bushes out front that are overgrown and just ugly, and you're ready for new bushes. All right, why don't you just cut those off at the base? Why does people insist on pulling those things out? They're going to regrow. So imagine if you have an ugly bush and you cut the bush and you plant irises or plant some sort of flower that's out there. And so you've planted that out there. And it constantly, what are you going to keep having happen? These different offshoots of this plant are going to come up. Okay? What the writer is here putting across is he's talking about this bitter plant that you don't want, especially among your food, especially among your crops that you have there. You've got to completely clean it out and completely get rid of that plant. Pull it up instead of cut it off. Christian-wise, you and I have to completely remove all the sin that's in our heart. Too many of us want to be halfway Christians. You get what You get what I'm saying? Friends of the world, friends of God. You want to kind of be in this world and be in that world, and both of them. And when that happens, you're going to have that root of bitterness. That root of poison, which will always be sprouting up and which will always be there. All right, Esau and the morsel. It's one of my favorite sermons to preach. What did he give up? Red lentils. What is a red lentil? It's a bean, okay? Esau gave up being the person of God's people, gave up all the blessings that come with bringing the Messiah because he wanted bean soup, all right? Now, maybe you really like bean soup, and maybe bean soup is just awesome in your mind, but that is not worth giving up all of that, is it? And you always look at Esau and you think, what a doofus. You know, who would give up all of that for bean soup? Now, was Esau evil? Why did he give up all that stuff for bean soup? He was tired. He was hungry. Okay. What happens if you go to the grocery store and you're really hungry? You buy too much and you buy the wrong thing, all right? Because you're hungry, you're like, man, I'd eat that. Man, I'd eat that. Man, that looks good too. Well, Esau put himself in a bad situation where his only choice was to give up everything to get those red beans. Be careful as a Christian that you don't find yourself in a situation where the only choice you have is a bad choice. Make it where you put yourself in a situation where you can make a good choice, not a bad choice and a worse choice. That's what Esau did. And so you see, because of his choices, he got himself into trouble. Okay? Let's look at verse 18. For ye have not come to the mountain that may be touched and burned with fire, to blackness and darkness and tempest, and the sound of a trumpet and the voice of the word, so that those who heard it begged that the word should be not spoken to them anymore. For they could not endure what was commanded. And if so much as a beast touches a mountain, it shall be stoned or shot through with an arrow. And so terrifying was it the sight that Moses said, I am exceedingly afraid and trembling. But you have come to Mount Zion, the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and the church of the firstborn who are registered in heaven, to the God and judge of all, to spirits of just men made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, to the blood of sprinkling that speaks better things than that of Abel. What he's doing is he's getting ready to close. This is a flourish that comes at the end of the sermon. This is, as in a generation past, we don't do it anymore because we have PowerPoint. But you remember this? Preachers would say, in conclusion, or they start the plan of salvation. And what would you hear all of a sudden? What's everybody doing? You remember that? You start pulling out your songbooks? Maybe only preachers remember that. But that used to be what would happen. You would say, okay, in conclusion, or start doing the invitation or whatever. Everybody has to pull out their songbook. Everybody has to get their purse right. Everybody has to wake their kid up, wake their husband up, and now we're ready, okay? Because you're about to stand up. That's what's happening here. This is a flourish. This is the point of the book where you pick up your songbook. All right. But he goes through, he's reviewing. He says, you've got Mount Sinai over here. Mount Sinai is the old law that you have left that you're wanting to go back to. Now recognize Mount Sinai burned. It had that fire upon it. Mount Sinai scared all your ancestors. They begged that only Moses would go up there, and they said it was too hard for us because everybody who was around there got killed. He's saying, look through your Old Testaments and notice the ways God killed everybody who was there. Look at your Old Testaments and remember how hard it was to be a good practicing Jew. Remember how terrible it was. Now look at Zion, the heavenly Jerusalem, the innumerable angels, all those who have been made perfect, all those who have experienced grace. And you look at those two and you decide which way you want to go. That's what this is about. He's saying if you're thinking about going back, you remember exactly what it is you're going back to. Now, what's our problem? We remember things with rose-colored glasses, don't we? Remember the children of Israel when they were walking through the wilderness? They kept saying, oh, we want to go back to Egypt because they had leeks and onions in their food. They had flavoring, and that food was pretty good. Now, what else had they endured in Egypt? Slavery, death of the firstborn, whippings and beatings. Did they remember any of that? No, they were thinking about onions, all right? We tend to memorize or remember certain things. Every once in a while I'm visiting with someone who's older, and they say, man, I'm picking cotton every day. And I miss those days that we were out, doing this or that or whatever else. Any of y'all ever pick cotton? It is not fun, right? I remember my grandmother one time challenged me, and she was like older than Moses. I think she was actually 80 years old. And she said, I bet I can pick cotton faster than you. And I was thinking, hey, I'm 12. I can beat you in anything. And she had that claw thing going. You know how women, or I guess all people would do it. And, we only made it like through 2 bushes, and I just picked off what was on top, But she'd always talk about how wonderful those days were. I don't want to go back to those days. That was hot, that was nasty, and that hurt. But she had those rose-colored glasses looking back at that. A lot of times we're that way about the church today. We want to go back to the old way, and we don't remember how rough it was. That's what was going on with these Hebrews. They were wanting to go back to the old way, but they didn't remember just how bad and terrible it was. All right, verse 25. See that you do not refuse him who speaks, for if they did not escape who refused him who spoke on earth, much more shall we not escape if we turn away from him who speaks from heaven, whose voice then shook the earth. But now he has promised yet once more, I shall shake not only the earth, but the heavens. Now this, yet once more, indicates the removal of those things which are being shaken, as of things that are made, that the things which cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us have grace by which we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear. For, verse 29, our God is a what? Our God is a consuming fire. Okay. Those things spoke on earth refer to the Ten Commandments, the old law given by Moses. And it shook the world when it came down. They endured that earthquake. And it shook the world throughout Canaan as the children of Israel came in and swept the land clean. And it shook the world as God's people were faithful. And it shook the world when God's people weren't faithful. And in 586, the temple was destroyed. The writer of Hebrews says, yes, that's true. But what we're talking about is something greater. Because while Sinai had an earthquake, we're talking about the one who's going to destroy the heavens and the earth, who at the second coming will make all these things disappear, and the only thing that's going to remain are those things which are spiritual and those things which are eternal. Now, I don't want to be in an earthquake, but that's a bigger deal when you talk about somebody who's going to destroy everything which is there. The kingdom cannot be shaken. Daniel 2:44, in the days of these kings, that is Rome, shall be a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. Matthew 16:18, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not what? Prevail against it. God's church is always going to survive. All right. Our God is a consuming fire. Is that still true today? Jonathan Edwards' famous sermon, Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God, and he talks about us as being like a spider being held by a string over a fire, and somebody's just going to let us go and watch us burn, okay? I don't know if I'd exactly go that way, but I think we do need to emphasize destruction a little bit more often than we do. Sometimes we want to get so much on God's love and grace and mercy, and those things are absolutely important. We also need to talk about the other side, right? Romans 11:22, consider therefore the goodness and mercy of God, or goodness and severity of God upon those who are good, God's everlasting love upon those who are evil, God's everlasting punishment. All right, we'll finish on that thought. Thank you for being here. And see you tonight, unless we're blizzarded in. Blizzarded. Blizzarded. Blizzarded.